days, it feels like MMOs distinguish themselves mainly on the subtle ways they differ from World of Warcraft. Rift is very much a creature of this era, albeit an uncommonly comprehensive one. Its designers are betting that Telara, a world more hazardous and less predictable than Azeroth, will prove enticing enough to encourage you to revoke your citizenship, or at the very least, take out a tourist visa. Is it time to start collecting your vaccinations? You have two factions, neither one especially good nor evil if you want to talk extremes, fighting for scraps in a world shattered by otherworldly forces. This setup may sound familiar, but don't judge Rift too harshly. The game manages to carve a cool universe out of the MMO boilerplate. On one side, you have the hard-edged, techno-magical Defiance, with their fancy armor and devil-may-care attitude toward the gods. On the other, you have the Guardians, chosen by the gods to keep civilization intact, but also to purge it where necessary. When not busy fighting one another, the factions strive to defend Telara from extraplanar invasions, which means elementals and worse running rampant around the world. These happen often. Rift generally plays like a standard post-WoW MMO. It's got most of the bells and whistles you'd expect of a game that hopes to be competitive in this day and age, but not all of them, though some of the elements that are missing appear to be absent by design. For example, don't expect a huge preponderance of fast travel points in Telara. You'll do a lot of walking and riding to get to where you want to go, with all the mob aggro and unexpected PvP this entails. In this way, the world is always hazardous, regardless of whether or not you presently want to engage it. Rift also assumes that you know what you're doing going in. If you don't know that you have to train your abilities after every level, Rift ain't gonna tell you. Rift's most meaningful contribution to the MMO canon lies in its namesake, the extra-dimensional rifts that spawn around Telara, seemingly at random. In actuality, they're both procedurally generated and triggered by men behind the curtain. The largest Rift events are public quests writ large, which draw every player in the area to contribute to zone-wide meta objectives. The end point, of course, is treasure, reputation, and tokens. But all sorts of great things happen in the process, from traveling through a zone without quests leading you by the nose, to engaging in unbidden PvP, if you're on an appropriate server. The opposite faction wants those source stones as much as you do, after all. For the most part, the rest of the Rift experience plays out in a way that rhymes with your expectations. When you hit the level cap, there are raids and expert mode dungeons to gear up for, instance PvP warfronts to grind through, and of course endgame rifts to trigger. Rift isn't trying to reinvent the elements that have emerged as conventions of the contemporary MMO, so if a system works well in WoW, expect a similar one to be in place here. Rift's class system aims for a broad level of customization and adaptability, and generally succeeds at this. Each of the 4 callings can fulfill at least 2 MMO roles, with some truly unconventional combinations, like clerics that tank or mages that heal. It all depends on what souls you have equipped, which function as a combination of classes and talent paths. Your character can equip 3 souls at a time, and as you invest points in a specific soul, you unlock more of its abilities. Rift makes it easy to swap between soul configurations as well, allowing you to have up to 4 roles on deck. All you have to do is pay for the privilege. Of course, there are limits to the soul system's variability. This being an MMO, there are specific soul combinations that are more optimal than others, and though the player base doesn't yet have the tools to measure things like PvE damage and healing as effectively as they'd like, it hasn't stopped many from passing judgment as to what constitutes a viable build. That said, Rift is young and thus in constant flux. The designers have so far been reactive enough to respond to the most serious disparities in balance, though perhaps not with the sufficient quickness to appease the most critical players. If you're no stranger to newly launched MMOs, then know the drill. Don't get too attached to the way your class works, especially if it seems to be overperforming. Rift looks decent enough without being too taxing on your hardware, and for an MMO, that's a good place to be. That said, there's a good bit of imagination on display here. Telara is not your typical epic fantasy world.
Your petty machines will help you no more than the gods you spurn!
Weird creatures abound, and even when you encounter something you'd consider garden-variety fantasy, it's usually been sufficiently gussied up to suit Telara's rough edge. The world, meanwhile, certainly does feel like it's beset by disaster. When you see a rift looming on the horizon, there's no question as to the nature of the beings that will spring forth. In terms of information design, Rift will feel very much familiar if you're a WoW player. All the interface elements behave in predictable ways, even down to the hotkeys in most cases. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Rift is a young game, so it's natural for it to exhibit some growing pains during these early months. Still, even amidst the relative flux of rapidly changing classes and other early game kinks, the experience feels remarkably complete and cohesive. If you're an old hand in MMOs who's seen it all before, Rift's subtle wrinkles, especially those of its class system, are interesting and well executed enough to be worth exploring. If it can keep the momentum from its strong launch, then we can predict for it a healthy future. In the short term, though, Rift provides an exciting alternative to that one big MMO, one that's similar enough to feel inviting to defectors, but distinct enough not to leave them totally stricken with deja vu.